Good morning. We are ready to start our morning keynote, and I am so excited to introduce Leah and Richard Rothstein, authors of The Color of Law and Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. About 5 years ago, CCLR did a webinar with Richard Rothstein centered on his book, The Color of Law, which brilliantly makes the case of how the federal, the state, and local governments gave rise and reinforced neighborhood segregation. It was one of the most widely watched and attended workshops CCLR ever did. A colleague from Groundwork USA recently shared with me how Richard's thought leadership was incredibly influential in her career decision to work with communities committed to undoing the harmful impact of segregation and to create more equitable neighborhoods. Now writing with his daughter, Leah Rothstein, a housing policy expert, they've released a new book, Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. Just Action is a blueprint for concerned citizen and community leaders, that is us, on ways to undo the impact of segregation and hold institutions accountable. I'm honored to have Leah here today for our morning keynote. Leah will speak for about 40 minutes, and then her father, Richard, will be joining us for Q&A after that. Newsflash, we have 40 free copies of Just Action, and Leah will be doing a book signing in the atrium immediately following her presentation. Please join me in welcoming Leah Rothstein.
Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? Great. Thank you. So, just a quick read of the room. How many folks here have read or are familiar with the arguments in The Color of Law? Okay, it's okay if you're not. I'm going to go over it. So just wanted to get a sense of the room. So I'm, as probably isn't a surprise, I'll be talking about residential segregation, the racial segregation of our neighborhoods. I'm going to start with some of a little summary from The Color of Law of the history of how we came to be a segregated country, because it's important to set the context of how we got here before we talk about how we get out of this situation. And so then I'll go into some solutions, which is from our new book, Just Action, which came out last year. So I'm going to start with talking about this idea of de facto segregation. This is a term, an explanation that we have adopted as a country to explain why we are residentially segregated by race. All over the country, metropolitan areas in all regions of the country are racially segregated. Particularly, the segregation of whites and African Americans is consistent and persistent all over the country in all types of communities and cities in all regions. And we tell ourselves as a country that the reason for this segregation is not because of government laws or policies, but because of private actors or bigoted landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans and white communities. Or it's a result of personal preference. We like to live around people who look like us, and so we tend to self-sort into same-race communities. Now, when we tell ourselves all of this, we say, many of us look around and say it's too bad that we're so racially segregated, but anything that happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. We not only have no responsibility to fix it, we also have no agency to do anything about it if it sort of was all out of our hands. Well, this de facto segregation idea is very pervasive. The Supreme Court has sort of adhered to this idea. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because the federal government had no role to play in creating segregation, it has no role to play in undoing it or challenging it. So in that context, my dad, Richard Rothstein, wrote The Color of Law in 2017 to take on the de facto segregation idea. And he called it an utter myth. The whole book is filled with detailed examples of government laws and policies that explicitly and intentionally created and sustained residential segregation. So with all of those examples, it's really hard to argue that segregation is a form of, segregation of our communities is a form of de facto segregation. It was clearly, there were private actors involved, and they're like those bigoted landlords, realtors, mortgage brokers, but their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by the government at all levels, local, state, federal government, to ensure that as we built communities, we built them on a segregated basis, and then that our policies maintain that segregation. Well, his call to action in The Color of Law was that if we come to understand that segregation was caused by government policy, which was unconstitutional. These policies were violations of the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And when we reckon with that history, we then can understand that we have an obligation to do something about it. It gives us agency back in the equation, and also responsibility and obligation, because when our government violates its own laws and Constitution, we as a country have an obligation to remedy those violations, not only to reverse them, but to remedy the harms that they've caused. But so far, nobody has stepped up, or we as a country haven't stepped up to remedy racial segregation, to live up to that obligation. So I'll give one example from The Color of Law. Again, it's just one of many government policies that created segregation. It's one of the more powerful ones from the mid-20th century, when millions of war veterans came home from World War II, started families, we had a baby boom, and there was a housing shortage. So we had just come out of a war, and before that, the Great Depression. Not a lot of homes were built in those decades. So these growing families looking for homes, increased demand and not enough supply of housing. Might sound familiar. But at the time, the federal government decided it wanted to do something about that to meet the demand for housing, and it did so by helping to build suburbs all over the country. Now, at the time, we weren't a suburban country. Most people lived in urban areas. That's where the jobs were. Those jobs employed people of all races, so those urban areas were fairly racially integrated, until the federal government came in and created suburban communities outside of the urban areas to move white families out of urban centers into these suburbs. And it did so by providing subsidies, federal loan guarantees to the developers of those suburbs. A famous example is Levittown outside of New York City on Long Island. William Levitt was the developer there. He decided he wanted to build 17,000 homes. 17,000 homes in a rural area where not a lot of people lived. He didn't have the money himself to finance that development. He couldn't get a bank loan because there weren't buyers lined up. There weren't people living in that area. It seemed pretty crazy. So the only way he could get the funds to build Levittown was through a federally backed loan guarantee provided by the federal government through the Federal Housing Administration. Now the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, would only give Levitt this loan guarantee if he promised to never sell his homes to African Americans. And the government required him to go further and put this in writing on the deeds of the homes that he built. These are called restrictive covenants. Written into the deeds of the homes, said the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. So this idea that this happened by accident, or it was, just private actors like William Levitt who wanted to do that himself, it's obviously nonsense. So the federal government, this wasn't the only way it did this. This was written into the FHA manual that for appraisers that worked for the FHA going around the country deciding which suburbs and subdivisions it would help finance, it required these restrictive covenants on new homes and suburban developments. In one example in The Color of Law, there's a photograph, I think it was Detroit, wall that was half-mile high and 6 feet high, half-mile long, that separated a white community from a nearby African-American community. The white community was a subdivision that a developer wanted to build. The Federal Housing Administration said, we will help you build that development if you build this wall to separate your community from the nearby African-American community. This was written into the Federal Housing Administration manual to require this kind of segregation and separation as it helped to expand housing around the country, limited to only whites. So, these examples, Levittown, Detroit, happened there, but it happened the same way all over the country, including in the West, in California, where we like to believe that we, don't have the same kind of racial history. Suburbs here were built on the same racially discriminatory basis, financed by the federal government. Now, William Levitt and builders like him who built these suburbs all over the country at the time, many of them were bigots. William Levitt said at the time, if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold his homes to African Americans anyway. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. And if we can imagine an alternate history where our federal government lived up to its constitutional obligation and said, we will provide you with this loan guarantee if you promise to sell your homes on a non-discriminatory basis, well, the country would look very different than it does today. Levittown today is 2% African American in a surrounding area that's 13% African American. And that disparity can be traced back to the policies in place when those homes were first sold. Now, when those homes were first sold, they were affordable to working families of any race. They cost about $100,000 in today's money. That is an affordable single-family home in a nice suburb. Hard to imagine today. But that's how much they cost. So African-American working families could afford that too, but they were explicitly prohibited from buying them. The white families who bought those homes when they were affordable, subsidized through the FHA by FHA-backed loans, or if they were veterans, by the Veterans Administration mortgages, they got homes that were affordable that then went on to accumulate in value. Those homes in places like Levittown, as we all know, they don't cost $100,000 today. Here in California, homes that were built under the same program cost $500,000 or over $1 million. The median home price in Levittown is over $600,000 today. So those white families who got into home ownership when it was affordable saw their homes increase in value, and they accumulated wealth in the process. They then used that wealth. They could send their kids to college or enjoy their own retirements, weather health emergencies. Most importantly, they could pass down that wealth to their children and grandchildren to buy their own homes. African Americans explicitly prohibited from building wealth in the same way by unconstitutional government policy. So this is why, even though, over 60 years ago we passed the Fair Housing Act that said we can no longer discriminate in the sale and rental of housing, those restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. But with the wealth gap that exists today because of those past government policies, that's somewhat of an empty promise to tell a family, an African-American family, you can buy homes in Levittown or suburbs like it on a non-discriminatory basis. You just need to have the wealth to be able to afford a $600,000 home. And they are far less likely to have that kind of wealth to be able to afford it because of these past government policies. So that wealth gap is one of the ongoing consequences of the policies that created segregation, but it's not the only one. The segregation of our communities underlies many of our most serious social problems and biggest racial disparities in this country. So as we work to address, disparities in education and income and health outcomes, we're mistaken if we don't look to the underlying issue of our segregated communities. So children who grow up in segregated African American communities, they go on to have higher rates of cancer. They're more likely to have asthma as children, grow up to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of cardiovascular disease, and shorter life expectancies than children who grow up in white communities. Now, this is because of the same policies that created segregation also created the segregation and separation of resources and opportunity. So segregated African American neighborhoods are more likely to be, I'm sure you all are very familiar with this, more likely to be near freeways with trucks that spew pollution, or industrial land uses, or on land that was formerly used as industrial uses and now has toxins in the soil. So those children absorb all of those toxins and grow up to have worse health outcomes than children in other segregated white communities. They also grow up to have lower incomes than children who grow up in white communities, lower rates of educational achievement. So all of these issues have to do with the communities where we are born and grow up, and the resources and opportunity available in those communities, which again come back to the policies that created segregation to begin with. So these ideas, this idea that government policy is behind the segregation of our communities and therefore we have an obligation to do something about it, has a little more currency since the color of law came out. I don't know if I have thought about this recently, and before 2017, before 2020, we didn't hear redlining thrown around that much in talking about how our communities, why they look the way they do, and now we hear that a lot. Whether you're sort of in the housing and community development land use field or not, it has more currency, it's more part of our national conversation than it was before, which is great. But, even though we see how segregation came to be and can see that we have an obligation to do something about it, it doesn't mean we know what to do. So a lot of people read The Color of Law, listened to my dad's talks about it, myself included, came up to him afterwards and said, wow, this is really important that we now are truly reckoning with this history, but what do we do about it? How do we get out of this? It doesn't seem easy or possible. Segregation feels very overwhelming, entrenched, so nuanced, and so many pieces that go into sustaining segregation. How can we possibly undo that? Well, he, as my dad, or many dads maybe do, he turned the question around on me and said, well, why don't you help me answer that? So I agreed, and we wrote Just Action to answer that question. What can we do to challenge segregation? And we give dozens of examples of local policies and practices that we can advocate for that can together go a long way towards challenging segregation and remedying its impacts. And I'll get into a few examples, but first I'll first give the overall argument of Just Action. And I'll say that as I speak about these solutions and what we can do in our own communities, I'm speaking to you as professionals in the land use field and as members and residents of your own communities, because those dual roles, what we do professionally, what we do personally, how we talk to our neighbors, how we show up at city council meetings, planning commission meetings, these are all important and what is needed to build the movement that we need to truly challenge segregation. It can't just stay at our desks, is what I mean. It has to go beyond that. Okay, so to live up to our obligation to challenge segregation, we argue that we need a reactivated, re-energized civil rights movement that can take on segregation. So the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s made a lot of great advances in racial equity, but left residential segregation virtually untouched, partly because it's difficult. So it's now time to take that extra step and go beyond that and really take on this issue. And to build this national civil rights movement, we argue we need to start locally. So even though the federal government had a large role to play in creating segregation, once segregation is established, to a large extent, it's sustained and maintained by local policies and practices and programs. So there's a lot we can do on the local level, a lot of policies we can change or adopt that can go a long way towards challenging segregation. And once we have wins locally, this can bubble up and start to build a national movement. We eventually will need some federal interventions and policy change, but if we start focusing there, we're gonna, we're in for a long fight that we're not very likely to win right now. But we can win local victories, and that will not only be very effective in challenging the segregation of our own local communities, but can then build towards a national movement to win those national victories eventually. So to build this national movement, how do we start? National movement on the local level. How do we start locally? Well, we argue that we need to build biracial, multi-ethnic committees, groups in our own communities with shared leadership between different races and ethnicities in order to start advocating around these issues. Now, to do that, we need to build social relationships and connections with people of other races. And as it so happens, most of us live in very segregated communities, so outside of the workplace, we tend, as Americans across the country, to not have a lot of social contact with people of other races. Going about our daily business in our segregated communities, going to the grocery store, dropping the kids off at school, we tend to see people who look like us, so that's who we, make social connections with. So we need to take some intentional steps, make some intentional efforts to build these cross-race relationships. We need to build up some social capital, trust between people of different races from segregated communities in the same area, that we can then use, those shared connections and relationships and trust to advocate together for change in our communities. So we give some examples in the book of some of these intentional efforts. They're really great stories. I don't have time to go into them now. But just to show that it might feel daunting, it might feel difficult, but it's not impossible. It just takes like a little effort to bring people together. And there's often people who want to start having these conversations and build these relationships. So that's how we start. And then often these groups then learn about the history of how the community that they're in came to be segregated. They might start to inventory and research those restrictive covenants and where they exist in their communities to start to learn how intentionally the segregation of their community occurred, because once you see that it was intentional action that created segregation, we can start to see that intentional action can start to undo it. It gives us some agency back. So then these groups, they're now formed, they're educated, they're ready to take on some local issues. What issues can they focus on? Well, we describe dozens of local policies, programs, strategies that these groups can focus on, and they fall into a few major categories. The first are what are called place-based strategies. These are strategies concerned with increasing investment in lower-income segregated African-American communities, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of the same policies that created its segregation. So to remedy the impacts of that segregation, we want to increase the resources, investments, access to opportunity in those areas. We also understand that when that happens, when investments increase in a lower-income community, what happens often is that people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living in those areas. They move in, they drive up the housing costs, we call this gentrification. The longtime residents of those areas then are priced out of their own community just when it's starting to see an increase in resources and investments. So we want to couple these place-based strategies with anti-displacement strategies to prevent some of the displacement that can occur when gentrification happens. We can do this with protections for renters against rapidly increasing rents, against unjust evictions, providing legal right to counsel, to legal representation for tenants facing evictions. We can pass inclusionary zoning ordinances that require that when new housing is built, which often happens in gentrifying areas, a certain percentage of those units have to be sold or rented at affordable prices. These are all locally passed, locally adopted ordinances and programs that can help prevent some displacement when housing prices are rising. One example I'll go into a little more detail on is a community land trust. How many folks here are familiar with community land trusts? I thought it might be. So there's over 300 communities around the country that have a land trust. They're nonprofit organizations, and they usually have the dual goal of preventing displacement in communities where housing costs are rising and providing permanently affordable home ownership opportunities in those communities for lower and moderate income families. Those are two big goals. How does it accomplish that? Well, a land trust usually acquires property, sometimes unused property from local governments, sometimes churches who have unused land. Companies can donate to a land trust their underused land or homes that have been vacated. And then the land trust fixes up those homes and sells them at affordable prices to lower and moderate income families. And in the sale, they sell just the house, and the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. That's how the home price remains affordable, because the cost of land is a big driver of the high cost of housing. So you take the land out of the equation, the house is more affordable. Those homeowners own the home like any other homeowner. They pay their mortgage, taxes, insurance. When they want to sell the home, they agree to adhere to a maximum resale price that limits the equity they can build in selling the home, but usually they can build some equity in that sale. And it limits the equity so that the home sale, the price is affordable to the next home buying family. So it's the only way to create permanently affordable home ownership opportunities without re-subsidizing the sale every time. It's a great model. As I said, 300 communities and growing across the country have a land trust. We wrote about one in Durham, North Carolina, that started when a group of residents of a lower income, predominantly African American neighborhood just started talking to each other about what they could do to improve conditions in their neighborhood. The first thing they wanted to do was get the city to build a park in their area because they didn't have one, and kids were playing in the streets, and it was dangerous. A kid had been hit by a car. And so they advocated that the city turn a vacant lot into a park, and the city agreed. They got the park, they won, they were galvanized, excited, looked around to see what else they could do to help their community. Their neighborhood was gentrifying. It was near Duke University that was expanding enrollment, so investors were buying up the homes to sell or rent to the Duke University community, and they wanted to prevent some of the displacement that was happening, so they learned about the land trust model, and they started one with 2 vacant homes. Fixed them up, sold them at affordable prices. They now have over 300 properties all around Durham, rental and for sale properties. When they started, the home sold for $100,000 in today's money. And now, because of that equation they use for the maximum resale price, their homes sell for $150,000. That's so that the home sellers can build up some equity and when they sell the homes. So slightly less affordable, but far more affordable than the home costs in the surrounding area that's about $500,000 today. So they've retained a lot of affordability, and they've prevented a lot of displacement in that community. On the blocks where the land trust acquired homes, most of the residents are still African Americans, and on the blocks where the land trust, investors outpace the land trust, most of the residents are now white. So we can see that this is a very effective strategy for creating affordable home ownership opportunities and preventing displacement. So what can we do with this example in our own communities? Find out if there's a land trust in your community and support it personally with time or resources. Start one if there isn't one. But most importantly is what we can do collectively in our own communities, in these committees we've formed to redress segregation, and that is advocating that local governments donate vacant land to a land trust, or that corporations who were involved, say, with the segregation of the community when it was first built on a segregated basis, many of them are listed on those restrictive covenants, the companies involved. Many of them are still in business or have been acquired by companies that are still in business. We can advocate that those corporations and companies live up to their obligation to redress some of the segregation that they helped to create. And one way they can do that is by supporting a land trust and ensuring that a land trust can expand its portfolio. Now, I talk about land trusts as an effective strategy in gentrifying communities, but it's also a very effective strategy in suburban communities, high-cost, exclusive, predominantly white communities, where the local governments of those communities are also often sitting on a lot of unused land, sometimes school sites that are no longer being used. We wrote about a couple communities where the local government took control of a vacant golf course that went out of business, a vacant country club that went out of business. The golf course was in Modesto, California, the country club in Connecticut. Those local governments now have huge pieces of land that they're trying to figure out what to do with. They could donate a piece of that land to a land trust to build these affordable homes that could help to desegregate those communities. But they won't do it unless local residents are advocating for that kind of land use. So that's another thing we can do collectively. So that's an example of a place-based and anti-displacement strategy. The other strategies, sort of category we talk about, are called mobility strategies. And these are strategies concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white, often suburban communities to more diverse residents. So challenging and redressing segregation involves both of these strategies simultaneously. So there's many ways we can do that. One is something we've been hearing a lot about lately is zoning. So most suburban communities are zoned to only allow single-family homes. Most residential land in this country is zoned only to allow single-family homes. It's one of the reasons we're in a housing affordability crisis today, because by limiting how many homes can be built on a lot, we're limiting how many homes can be built overall, and as demand for homes increases, supply cannot increase to meet that demand, so prices just go up, and that's how we found ourselves here today. Well, a little known piece of the zoning story is the history of single-family only zoning can be traced back to a time when cities were allowed to zone by race, and many did. They zoned their residential areas by which race could live in them. So this is a white residential area, this is a black residential area. And that was, allowed. Many cities did that. And at some point, the Supreme Court said you can no longer do that. You can't zone by race. So those cities instead adopted single-family zoning in those white areas to ensure that the homes in those areas stayed expensive, unaffordable, inaccessible to anyone but white families with this inherited wealth that they got through federally subsidized programs. You see how all of this sort of snowballs into where we are today. So we have an obligation to address single-family only zoning, not only to address the housing affordability crisis that is affecting all of us, but also to address the segregation and exclusivity of these suburban communities. So many communities now are addressing zoning. California is requiring cities to allow more than one home per lot. Other states have done that as well, because cities aren't quick enough at rezoning their single-family only areas, so states are stepping in, which is good. And, cities are doing this through allowing accessory dwelling units on a single-family lot, or allowing duplexes or triplexes where once only one house was allowed on that lot. Or some cities are also zoning areas near transit or commercial corridors to allow even denser housing, a few stories, or even a minimum story requirement near transit to ensure that we're incentivizing dense housing where it makes sense. And this is an important piece for desegregating these exclusive suburban areas, because by allowing a more diverse housing type and housing sizes in these areas, we can then produce a more diverse and broader range of affordability of homes. Smaller homes are naturally more affordable than large single-family homes on large lots. So this is one way we can address desegregating these areas, because these naturally affordable smaller homes can be affordable to what we call the missing middle. These are middle-income families that make too much to qualify for low-income subsidized housing and make too little to be able to afford market-rate housing. Many middle-income families fall in this category. Most African Americans fall in this missing middle category. They don't fall into the very low-income category that qualifies for subsidized housing. So if we want to address the needs and demand for African American families to live in these more expensive communities, we need to be addressing the need for middle-income housing, and one way to do that is to change our zoning codes. Now, I know that this isn't easy to do. When we try to change zoning, allow denser housing, or even propose a denser housing development with lower costs, there's often a lot of community opposition. So much so that they've come to have their own name, NIMBYs, not in my backyard. These are people who tend to agree with housing affordability ideas in general until an affordable housing development or a denser housing type is proposed in their own community, and then they vehemently oppose it. So one of our one thing that I advocate for in Just Action and in my talks about it is that we build up the kind of support for this kind of development that the NIMBYs have built their opposition for. The NIMBYs often argue, that changing the density of their neighborhood will, affect the character of their community. And I would argue that when we reckon with the true history of why the community looks the way it does, that it was racially discriminatory intent to begin with, that maybe we don't want to protect that character. Maybe we want to then instead go the other way and create a community that's more inclusive and more accessible to all kinds of families. And we believe that there's enough support for that kind of change in our communities, and just as much, if not more, than there are opposers to those kinds of changes. But the opposition feels so personally impacted by these changes that they're very motivated to show up at community meetings and voice their concerns and their opposition. And the supporters are less personally motivated. So we need to feel that personal motivation that will get us out to these meetings, talking to our neighbors about these issues, ensuring that the people who will benefit from the housing directly can come to the meetings and support them. These are city council meetings, planning commission meetings, And that's how we then can ensure that these denser developments, more affordable housing options, rezoning efforts can be passed, particularly in these exclusive suburban communities. So that's another call to action I'm offering to you. So one other sort of category of strategies we talk about have to do with increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in all kinds of neighborhoods. So there are a lot of ways we can do that. Down payment assistance programs targeted specifically to African American families to make up for that wealth gap, the intergenerational wealth that they're less likely to have. Home ownership, education, counseling programs, subsidies, loan programs to help get them into homes. And then there's ways, there's ways that African Americans have been explicitly prohibited from home ownership, like the restrictive covenants I've talked about. But there's also ways that they are sort of prohibited or face obstacles in getting into home ownership that are less explicit and less obvious that we also need to address. One of those is the credit scoring system. So we think of the credit scoring system as an objective system. It's an algorithm, so it's math, it must be true, it doesn't have opinions in it. And it takes your financial history into this algorithm and gives you a score that tells a bank if you're a good candidate for a loan in the future. So if your financial history shows that you've paid your debts on time, they think you're more likely to pay your debts in the future, you'll get a higher credit score. So that makes sense, but it's not as objective as we think because it only factors in a certain type of financial history. It only factors in what's called traditional financial instruments. These are bank loans, credit cards, mortgages, the type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. So segregated African American communities have fewer bank branches than white communities at all income levels. Middle income African American communities have fewer bank branches than middle income white communities. So if you have less access to a bank, you're less likely to go into that bank to apply for a credit card or get a loan. You might be more likely to use what is in your neighborhood, which is more likely to be, say, a payday lender. You can use a payday lender when you need it, pay back that loan and its exorbitant interest rates on time and in full. That financial history is not factored into a credit score because it's considered non-traditional. Similarly, if you've had a mortgage in the past, which whites who are applying for a mortgage are more likely to have been a homeowner in the past, so have a mortgage history to feed into their credit score. So you paid your mortgage on time, that helps your credit score. If you've been a renter your whole life, so you're applying for a mortgage for the first time, but you've been a renter your whole life, you've paid your rent on time every month for your whole life, even as rents go up every year, like mortgages don't, that financial history does not factor into a credit score either. So as a result, we have a system, the credit scoring system, which is racially neutral on its face and in its intent, but it's racially discriminatory in its effect. So as a result, about a third of blacks, a third of African Americans versus 17% of whites have no credit score. That's because they don't have the kind of financial history at all to feed into the credit scoring system. So 33% versus 17%. And then of those with a credit score, African Americans, 20% of African Americans, over 50% of African Americans and 20% of whites have a credit score that isn't high enough to qualify for a mortgage. And in most cases, this isn't because their financial history isn't good and reputable and creditworthy, it's because it's not the right kind of financial history. So this is, one of those issues that might seem like we can't do anything about it. The credit scoring system, it's a national system run by 3 credit scoring agencies, but we can work with our local bank branches and credit unions to adjust how they calculate credit scores internally for their own mortgage candidates. And we wrote about some banks that are doing this. So again, this is another thing locally. We can advocate that our local financial institutions start to factor in rental payment history, for example, into their credit scoring algorithms. Goes a long way towards opening up credit access for African Americans looking to buy a home. So that's another example of what we can do locally. Again, these are just a few examples. We have many more in the book, a lot more to say about all of them. But I hope that what comes across is that this idea that it's too overwhelming that we couldn't possibly do anything to challenge segregation in our own communities, I hope we put that idea to rest, because there's actually so much that we can do. That the only thing stopping us is ourselves. We just need to get started on any one of these strategies, and it will start to chip away and start to challenge and remedy the harms of segregation. So with that, I hope that this gives us some ideas to go back to our communities to get started towards working towards these changes. And thank you for listening. We now have about 15 minutes for questions and answers, and I think my dad will come on a screen. And I think there's a mic there if you'd like to ask a question. And if you, because we can't see each other, so if you just tell us which of us you're asking, oh, I can see him, okay. Who you're asking the question to, that would be great. So, thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for breaking that down for us. Your new book. I did read The Color of Law in grad school, and it was very, very helpful. I was in a policy program, so very salient. I had a question when you were talking about community buy-in, as well as the groups, what were you saying, like boards or groups that need to be formed. Do you have any tips or tricks for getting community buy-in? Because I personally am a grant administrator. Our project is a Promise Zone. We have a lot of very passionate residents, but when it comes to getting them to actually come to a meeting or to show up, there's a lot of challenges. They have 2-3 jobs that they are doing, and they just don't have the capacity. And it's not that they don't care, but it's like, how do we get them in that room, and how do we get them all on the same page so that the message is super clear? And either one of you can answer that.
I just came from a conference where there was an entire session on this, and it's not, as you know, it's not easy. No. There's the obvious answers, making it easy and accessible, having the meetings where people are, childcare, food, stipends, making it worth people's while. I think also diversifying how we collect information, so it's a way that maybe people don't have to show up in person. I think also working through existing channels of institutions that people are already involved with is useful. Churches, congregations, other community organizations where people are already putting their time to gather information that way. And then I think it's just it's a long, slow effort to build community support. And I know coming from local government or institution, might not be the best sort of initial way, but working with existing organizations, I think, is the way to begin. I'm not sure if that's anything new that you don't know, but.
A little new, but also it is just an ongoing challenge that I think any local jurisdiction is going to face in underserved neighborhoods. So, but any examples, case studies, obviously the book will be very helpful, just to see, how other people are approaching it, because I think oftentimes we do approach it very similarly too, and I think there's ways to innovate in that way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I could give some examples that didn't get into the book of cities that were looking at rezoning efforts, for example, and they went around, they did community meetings all over the city. They had different kind of, I think it was Louisville, Kentucky, brought Legos. They had a whole sort of way of simulating zoning, and they separated people into different groups, gave them, these Legos represent single-family homes, apartment buildings, and you have to fit them all into this area. How are you going to do it? So getting people engaged in conversations that they might not think zoning is something I should care about or can understand, but bringing it to them on that level. It got a lot of community buy-in. They also did an online history sort of deck of how their city came to be segregated, all the policies that went into segregating their community, and then fed that into their rezoning effort. So people also understood that this isn't just happening right now. It's trying to address a legacy here and they had great support for their rezoning efforts. So I think there's a lot of examples, creative examples out there that we can follow. Atlanta is doing something similar. There's a lot of cities working on these issues. So thanks.
I like the Lego idea.
Yeah,
That's a
the
great
Lego thing
idea.
is really cool.
That's really creative. Oh. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Adria Fox, C4GS, Communities for Global Sustainability. I have questions. So we're a community first developer, and so I'm always interested in the history. So this is probably a question is for your father. So when you were talking about the initial federal laws that were in place, how does that also relate to the voting laws? Was that also during the time when blacks had gotten their rights to vote, and then the other years that followed when then Latinos got the right to vote, they were actually the last to get the right to vote? Because I'm trying to wrap my mind around like the disparities across all the ethnic groups related to when they got the right to vote.
Well, the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. By that time, the patterns of segregation that the federal government was working to create had pretty much been firmly created. The examples that Leah gave in the immediate post-World War II period, when the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, and Veterans Administrations implemented a program of subsidizing whites to move out of urban areas into single-family homes and suburbs. That was in the immediate post-war period. The Voting Rights Act came some 15 years after that. And by then, we were pretty much a suburban country on a racially divided basis. So by the time the Voting Rights Act was passed, and of course, it wasn't immediately effective. It mostly affected the South, and we had segregation in the North as much as well as in the South. So the Voting Rights Act itself was not sufficient to reverse any of these policies.
Okay. And then as other people got the right to vote and they became aware, I think that's what I'm getting to the point. They didn't become aware and civically engaged until they understood their voting rights. So that's kind of the connection if you're thinking about in a city. Like once you become aware of your civic rights, then you can understand like how your vote matters, and especially only basically at the local level. Anyway, I have another question, probably for.
Let me just say one more thing about that. You know, even people who always had the right to vote, whites in particular, didn't believe in the myth that Leah described as de facto segregation. And the same thing is true of African Americans and Hispanic Latinos. We all believe in that myth of de facto segregation. The history of how we have an unconstitutional system of residential segregation is something that did not, learning that history did not depend on getting the right to vote. It depended on educating the public about how to use that right. And that has only happened fairly recently.
Thank you so much. And then my other question is probably maybe for both of you. It's related to how do we, so I live in an area in San Diego that's near San Diego State University. And so some of the newer housing laws to create affordable housing are transitioning these so-called affordable housing units more to benefit the lack of housing for students. And so I don't know like what regulations happen, but they'll, like for example, there's a building right in front of me that supposedly was a zone to be affordable housing. And yes, it is technically, but once they built it, now they're marketing to the college because the college has a lack of housing for their students. So those housing won't even become available for people that really need them on the affordable market. It's a whole nother policy question. I don't know if we can answer it today. Thank you.
Do you have anything, Dad, you want to say about that?
We have overall enormous shortage of housing. And we need to do much, much more to create housing, not only affordable for low-income families and households, but for moderate-income families and households who in today's market can't afford housing, even if they earn more than what is provided by federal subsidies. So we need to do much, much more housing production so that we don't have to choose who needs the housing and should get it. They all should get it.
Yeah, and I would add that we have to be careful about what we're building. So family affordable housing, might not as easily be taken by students, although they can double, triple up and be in larger units. But like my dad said, if there's a lack of housing for everyone, students need housing too. So if we're not building enough for students and families, then we're gonna have this problem where there's always competition. There are some cities that put some preferences, have preference policies on the affordable housing that they help to subsidize. It can be, I know Oakland has or had a preference policy for those who were displaced from the city or at risk of displacement, and they had a way of defining that. So there are ways to sort of narrow it down to try to meet the need of the population you're trying to meet. Also, just the marketing of those units, a lot of affordable housing that's publicly subsidized can have an affirmative marketing requirement that ensures that it's marketed to the communities that they're trying to reach, so it's not just, in student papers or whatever for advertising those units. So those are some of the ways to address that.
First, I'd like to just thank you for the work that you've done. It's really changed the discourse of conversations in our communities, so thank you. I was just wondering your reaction to the impact of the color of law. Anything that specifically surprised you or gratified you in the impact the book has had in the public?
Well, I was stunned by the impact, and I'll say it is now pretty much conventional wisdom. I don't think that the de facto is as much currency anymore. My publisher, when public color was first published, did an initial run of 5,000 copies and didn't know how many would be left over in his warehouse after those had been printed, and now 1 million copies have been sold. So it's had enormous impact. You see references to the idea no longer. It's not necessary to quote the color of law. You see references in the public discussion all the time about how the government is responsible for segregation and creating. So my answer is I was surprised and gratified. But not everybody understands the end. It's still a case that we're always running into the groups where we talk, and Leah and I talk, and people still don't understand it. So there's never an end to this work of explaining to people what this history is. The key point, though, this is why we wrote the second book, is knowing the history is important, but in the long run, what's more important is what you do about it. And that's why Just Action, I think, is was never going to be as popular a book as The Color of Law. It's really an important book in The Color of Law.
I want to thank you both for your scholarship on this issue. It's been foundational for my understanding and for the conversation I think we're having and should continue having. I'm curious, I've worked in land use reform for a while at the state level in California, and I think there's a couple of systems I see at work in terms of public investment versus kind of market forces and our ability to advocate to change the impact that both those systems have on what our communities look like and shape that impact. And I'm curious, kind of in your thoughts around Just Action, how do we take action through both those systems, or do we need to take action to fundamentally change underlying assumptions in those systems, and kind of how do you balance those two in terms of the results we can see from our limited capacity?
So the systems of public investment versus private forces. So both are important. I don't have an easy answer that, one is a better place to start. We describe in Just Action strategies that involve advocating for local policy change and how local government addresses land use issues and housing issues. We also describe strategies for advocating that local companies, corporations, banks, insurance companies, realtor companies that were involved with creating and sustaining segregation, that they also have a role to play in the solutions. And both of those avenues of advocacy are, I would say, equally important. And as we say a lot, it doesn't really matter which we start with, just that we start somewhere. We're going to need all of those avenues eventually, and so starting in your community in the way that makes the most sense locally, and that depends on local market factors, local government, the development issues going on in your city, to try to determine what the most effective place to start is. But I wouldn't recommend taking any of it off the table. Sorry, it's not an easy answer.
I have an easy question.
Oh, great.
But thanks for your work and for your scholarship and for being here. We've talked in other sessions at this conference about how generational wealth relates to the occurrence of brownfields. Generational wealth facilitates community health and economic development, and the more healthy a community, the fewer the brownfields, or at least the initiative to redevelop abandoned land. And in my work, in neighborhoods where there's a lot of urban renewal and the displacement of single-family residents in places like West Oakland, and the warehousing of those people in housing authority housing now, where they're renters and they're not owners anymore. Have you worked, I'm sure you have, and I'm curious what your perspective is on something that could be done immediately or quickly, is the reversion of those units, deed those units to the people that are living in those units, immediately begin to facilitate generational wealth by replacing a renter by an owner. The dissolution of a housing authority or its replacement by an HOA. So what you're paying in rent, now you pay for your upkeep fees. But you have a deed, you build a credit history. I'm just curious, I've heard other folks talking about it in other places. I'm just wondering what you've heard or thought about in this space.
I'll start, and then Dad, if you have anything. You can't see me. I can't think off the top of my head of any examples of exactly what you're talking about, but land trusts could help facilitate that. The issue is that folks living in public housing then can't necessarily afford, a mortgage on that home or HOA dues if they're, not continuing to be subsidized in the same way that they are in public housing. So one way to do that is through Section 8. The Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program is a rental subsidy that can be used for home ownership. Every housing authority has the authority to do that, to use some of their vouchers as home ownership vouchers. Not many do that. In fact, when we were researching this book, I couldn't get from HUD how many housing authorities offer a home ownership option. But there are some that do. Oakland does. It involves, increasing the capacity of the housing authority to understand the home ownership market, to have banks that they work with who will provide a mortgage to a home buyer who uses Section 8 to pay part of their mortgage. And it works the same way, where the home buyer would pay 30% of their income towards the mortgage, no matter what their income is, and then the voucher makes up the difference up to a maximum amount. Now, it's hard in places like Oakland where homes are so expensive, because the voucher still won't cover enough to cover the whole mortgage. But it is a place to start to look into that, especially if you're talking about converting already publicly owned homes. They won't be as expensive, although the upkeep and the maintenance and getting them into good conditions would be. So there's a lot of factors in there, but it's an interesting thing to look into. And I would say my first thoughts are, land trusts and the Section 8 home ownership program as the first avenues to address that. Do you have anything else to add?
Sure. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the role of generational wealth in perpetuating the segregation that we have. Leah described before how the suburbs that were created immediately after World War II created enormous wealth for the whites who were subsidized to buy those suburban homes, those modern suburban homes. But when the whites moved into those homes, they didn't expect to get wealthy. This was a quirk of economic fate that those houses appreciated so vastly in value over the next couple of generations. In order to gain that kind of, so it's true that the segregation policies of the federal government created generational wealth for white working class and middle class, lower middle class families by subsidizing those home purchases at prices that were inexpensive compared to what they later became. Surprisingly, that is not likely to be duplicated. So simply generate generational wealth by placing people in home ownership as opposed to rentals is somewhat exaggerated. You can only do that if you're placing them in homes that are going to appreciate the value at the astronomical rates that those suburban homes did in the mid-20th century. Now, there are many good reasons to put people in ownership rather than rentals. People who own homes are more stable. They're more involved in their communities. They're more involved in their children's schools. They're more likely to vote. So there are many good reasons to give people ownership, besides the expectation is going to somehow spectacularly generate wealth for them and their children.
All right, I think we have time for one more. That's you.
Yes, good morning. Again, thank you for your scholarship. This is, I've read the book, very enlightening. Question about Community Reinvestment Act and to what extent you all have dug into that as a tool that, I mean, it is a good policy, but it does need to have more teeth. I think it needs some revisions to it to help, force banks to do a little bit more in terms of their lending policies.
Yeah, great question. We do write about the Community Reinvestment Act and Just Action. You're right, it needs more teeth. It needs some language around race. But as it stands, it's up to community groups to advocate that the Community Reinvestment Act is enforced the way it should. And so we write about some examples of groups that have organized, Community Reinvestment Act sort of opposition to mergers and acquisitions when banks have not performed equitably in their communities and have won, some significant community benefits agreements. So yes, it needs reform, but there's still a lot we can do with it now as it stands, but it's up to community groups advocating and being involved in that process, being aware of banks that are, what their CRA scores are, when they're applying for federal regulatory approval for mergers and acquisitions, and when the community has, a point of leverage to block those approvals in exchange for some community benefits. And many have done that successfully, so we should continue that work. I think that's it. So thank you so much.
Richard, Leah, thank you so much for being with us today and for your continued work. We look forward to what's coming next. Again, as I mentioned, we have 40 books that we have purchased and making available to you that Leah will be signing in the atrium between now and 10:30. So we have a half an hour break until 10:30, and I'm just going to let you know what panels will be coming up at 10:30 so you can make a selection now. We'll have Heat is On, Climate Cleanup and Closure, that will be here. You can go to Section A, What to Expect When You're Expecting to Work with the Water Board, and Empowering Communities for Equitable Development, Lessons and Strategies from the Greenlining the Block in the East Wing Activity Room. So we have a half an hour break. Go out to the atrium if you'd like to get a copy of the Just Action. And again, thank you so much, Lee and Richard, for being with us today.